Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tino Cuellar, and I'm the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. For nearly 114 years, the Carnegie Endowment has sought to hasten the abolition of war. So you can understand why an institution dedicated to international peace is hosting a conversation about the dynamics of an ongoing war with 4 prominent military analysts. But peace is not just the absence of conflict. We're working towards a meaningful peace, one that is just and lasting, one that makes healing and rebuilding possible, one that reduces the very real danger that a third phase of the war in Ukraine will simply recur at some point in the future, and one that makes the world safe for international cooperation on the most pressing issues of our time. That means defending core principles of the international system, such as the rules against aggressive war, the right of nations to defend themselves when attacked. It also requires that we respond to the events of the present while encouraging pragmatic, strategic thinking about the future. Today's conversation prompts us to do just that as we look at the battlefield in Ukraine. We are gathering just over 2 years and 3 months since Russia launched its full-scale invasion, which has led to hundreds of thousands of casualties, more than 10 million Ukrainians displaced internationally or abroad, and led the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office, who discussed this issue with me right here on this stage, to open around 100,000 war crimes investigations. This devastation makes the goal of reaching a lasting peace even more daunting. Now, early in the war, Ukraine, the United States, and its allies and partners made important decisions around financial support and military aid. Sustaining that support remains critically important for the international system, as we recognize that the political environment in which many leaders, Western leaders, for example, operate has become more constraining. Today's conversation is about the decisions that must be made again by Ukraine and its allies to bring about a meaningful peace in the years to come. To help us understand the moment, I am delighted to welcome 4 experts to the stage. Andriy Zagorodnyuk served as Ukraine's defense minister from 2019 to 2020 and is now chairman of the Kiev-based Center for Defense Strategies, which he co-founded. Andriy was head of the Reforms Project Office of the Ministry of Defense and led key military reform initiatives in Ukraine. Hanna Shelest is a Ukrainian military analyst and the Security Studies Program Director at the Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism. Hanna previously spent over 10 years as a senior researcher at the National Institute for Strategic Studies under the President of Ukraine, Odessa branch. Michael Kofman, one of our own, is senior fellow here at Carnegie's Russia-Eurasia program and an expert on the Russian military, Ukrainian armed forces, and European security issues. Our moderator this afternoon, Dara Massicot, is also a senior fellow at Carnegie's Russia-Eurasia program, an expert on defense and security issues in the region, and a terrific moderator, I know. Thank you all for joining us today. The topic is grim, but absolutely among the most important things we work on. Dara, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at a very critical time. I don't want to beat around the bush too much, and I'd like to begin asking our very distinguished panel some difficult questions. A longtime panelist, and I'm not quite as experienced as a moderator, so hope you'll bear with me. You all should have QR codes on the papers in front of you, and there's also a code on the wall if you'd like to submit your questions online. That also holds true for those of you who are joining us virtually today. So without further ado, I want to ask Mike the first question. Mike, can you give us an overview of your assessment of the battlefield situation right now? And what are key objectives from the Russian side and Ukrainian side, and your assessment of their strengths and weaknesses as we look forward through the summer to December?
Okay, well, I'll try to do my best within a minute or two to kind of maybe provide a scene setter of the situation. I think it's fair to say right now that the front line around Kharkiv has more or less stabilized, and that the situation overall at the front for Ukraine looks better than it did a month or a month and a half ago. But we're still in a relative period of vulnerability. First, Russia retains their strategic initiative along much of the front line, and Russia holds material advantages in manpower, in equipment, and ammunition. Those advantages have not been decisive. As you and others have probably observed, Russian military has been largely confined to incremental gains, slow advances, and is very constrained in their ability to employ forces on a large scale. So they've not been able to attain breakthroughs or to attain momentum and exploit it. Now, Ukraine, I think, is recovering from a number of disadvantages. First and foremost amongst those were manpower. So the passing of the 2 mobilization laws and increase in mobilization have been very important since those have taken effect in May. Obviously, the supplemental material support from the United States has been another major factor. It's going to buy time, give confidence and resources, and at least create the opportunity to reconstitute Ukrainian military power. And Ukraine has been in the process of building fortifications, but it still has quite a ways to go when you look at the size of both the line of control and the overall front line, considering the border with Russia. So I wouldn't say that right now we're kind of out of the period of vulnerability yet. I think it's still going to be a very difficult year. And to be frank, this year is a relative window of opportunity for Russia, but so far they've not made much of it. And their relative advantage compared to their goals is likely to decrease as we get into the next year. And last point, what are Russia's objectives? It's clear that Moscow is still very much focused on taking the rest of the Donbass, which is primarily Donetsk. Now, the 2 main axes they're trying to push is one, and it had been in progress since the capture of Avdiivka, one going from Avdiivka towards Pokrovsk, or just east of Pokrovsk, the main transit hub, and a second is Chasiv Yar to take the strategic heights and provide access to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. So they're still focused on the main transit hubs and population centers in Donetsk. Kharkiv was an offensive that I think was intended to create a buffer zone, but more importantly, an effort to try to draw Ukrainian reserves and fix them there, although they haven't made much of it. And I think the fighting there has largely stalled out for Russia. So I think that's relatively where we are. I think Ukraine has the opportunity this year to hold Russia to incremental gains and ideally stabilize the front. And then Western capacity in terms of production of ammunition and the other resources will hopefully increase as we get towards the end of this year. And that's roughly the trajectory we're on. But obviously there's a summer and fall of hard fighting still ahead.
Thanks, Mike. That's a really great overview for us to set the table. Hanna, I'd like to turn to you from the view from Ukraine. We've had a 6-month delay in the U.S. supplemental that's had an impact on the battlefield. I'm wondering if you could share how that's been, your views on what it's meant for the battlefield, what it's meant for the morale amongst the units and the troops, and how Kyiv is interpreting our partnership as a result of the delays.
Thank you for this question. There are definitely several levels on this. First of all, if we are simplifying the supply that we are receiving, we can define them for those that are helping us to protect the critical infrastructure. And that's where we've been significantly dependent on the air defense, those Patriots and others. And we felt the delay in the supply with the success of the attacks. Even with the simplest things, because each morning we are receiving the data from the MOD, like it is public, how many Shaheds, for example, or missiles been coming, how many of them intercepted. And you could see a clear correlation in terms of the success of the interception for many of the attacks compared of what you had, let's say, summer last year, and now Russians are not using the new types of the weapons here. So it's not that we suddenly receive the new technology, that they are becoming more advanced. But we see that if it is the small attack, how many percentage we can intercept, and if it is the massive attack, how much we can intercept. As soon as Ukraine received a new supply package, immediately you saw the increased percentage of interception. So for all those problems that we currently have with the energy infrastructure, that so many objects being seriously are damaged, that is the result of not a sufficient amount of the ammunition that we needed for the interception. The second part, it is the artillery that are used at the very front line. So it is not the whole territory of Ukraine where you need to protect the critical infrastructure, but that's what the units are using there. And again, we saw the numbers that was a period, like Russians originally were 10 times in the superiority, then at a certain moment we were coming almost to the parity, then again it is the significant increase. And you see the reports from the ground, how they really need to count how many of the missiles they can use per day and how it influences different battlefields. So here, in terms of the morale coming to these, both for the population and for the forces, the question was like, you see the results of what we are not having. Why you are continuing using Ukraine for the domestic discourse. So if the discussions in the US would be about escalation in Ukraine, or should we give this or that type, that would be more understandable because, like, what are the concerns? But considering that the whole discussion originally especially went to the border against something, for people who are not that deep in the US politics, that was absolutely not understandable. So that's first of all undermined the image of the US itself, that is not that reliable partner. And that was the average Ukrainian probably thought about this. The same was with the soldiers on the front line. They said, yes, we will fight with or without the support, because that is our land, that is existential war, that's important for us, but we cannot fight against the artillery with the knives. So what you would like us, just to die, not to allow Russians to come to Poland, or would you like us really to defend the land and to be capable? So these discussions definitely started to be, and that's allowed also Russians to use a lot of the propaganda through the social networks, trying to undermine that, look, as US left Afghanistan, as what they did in Iraq, you're the next one. They don't care about you. They will never support you. They are not reliable. So that would have a long-term consequences as well. These delays, doesn't matter what was the reason, because it's all about their perception. The situation now with the last weeks, yes, we see the changes. We saw the changes on the north with the Kharkiv. We see the changes on the south in Kherson region of the dynamics of what is happening on the ground. We hope that it will lead to the additional changes for the long term. At the same time, that started to be more hope in Europeans, because we also need to understand that it was the huge contrast. You had the US arguing and, as it was seen, neglecting Ukraine. And you had France with the statements of Macron about readiness to send the soldiers, about the increased production. You saw a Czech initiative of searching around the globe. Understandable that it's not compatible what some of the European countries are giving and what US were giving in terms of the military. But perception matters, because it happened at the same time, that Europe really speed up, Europe is ready, Europe is understanding, and the US, where will it lead? Because elections are just starting, so the expectation that it can become even worse. And that is the issue that probably will influence for the future in terms of the morale as well.
Thank you so much. And we were recently talking about the different regional information operations that you've detected coming out of Russia. From that time period, in your point of view, during the delays, were there any specific campaigns that you felt like were gaining traction or successful? And are they still active, or have they gone away or changed?
Let's say one of the campaigns is definitely anti-mobilization campaign that is happening, but it is all around Ukraine. And I cannot say that it is connected with the delay of the US support. It's more about the general Ukrainian situation in terms of mobilization. But what's definitely connected, that is the campaign connected with the energy infrastructure and the deficit of electricity. Because here you had just because of the technical issues, you had the disproportion of the supply of the electricity. And Kyiv and Odessa were two cities with the biggest problems. Like in my city of Odessa on the south, we had 20 hours without electricity. Anybody would be dissatisfied, doesn't matter what is the reason. And here at the same time, because that was after the Russian targeting, we started to see very serious narratives and very massive campaign in the social networks with the pro-Russian channels, Russian channels, and anonymous channels spreading two ideas. First of all, that your government is like who is guilty? It is your government. It's not Russians. So it's not Russians who are shooting. It is your government that is incapable, your government that would like to continue the war, and so on and so on. So it is really undermining the Ukrainian government. The second is that, look, Lviv, that is more pro-Ukrainian, and Ukrainian speakers, they are with the light. They can go to the cinema. And you in Odessa, because you still can return to the Russian family and wherever, you are punished and they will not give you the electricity. The bad thing that because of the creativity and massive approach in spreading this information, we started to see tracks that people started doubting. And even those people who were not pro-Russian, but they started to repeat some of these narratives, especially dissatisfaction against other regions, like why it is not the equality in how we receive. People don't care that it's technically impossible because in Odessa region we are not producing electricity. So like if something happening, yes, we are dependent that much. But most of the average persons on the ground definitely don't know about this. But they bought it that some regions are more favorable for the government than other regions. And these internal conflicts, that's what Russians are really aiming in, because they need the social stability inside of Ukraine.
Thank you. This is a very complex picture. Thank you for sharing that with us. Andriy, I'd like to switch gears slightly and ask you a strategy question. I'm also interested in your thoughts from Kyiv on how the war is going and your impressions on what the current military strategy is this year for the rest of 2024. And if you had ideas, or if you could make modifications or changes to the strategy, what would you do and what would you recommend to set them in a great position for 2025?
Right. Thank you.
Small
So
question.
first of all, yeah. So first of all, we need all to understand, and sometimes when we come to cities like of our key allies, there's still a vast majority of people don't understand how dramatically changed the nature of the war in the last year and a half, particularly with the application of unmanned systems. And that it changes completely the doctrines, and it changes approaches, and it changes the chances for the successful or unsuccessful operations. I mean, this is a totally new war, and this trend is not just going to continue in the war, Russian invasion on Ukraine, but it's going to change the most likely global dynamic as well. The land operations per se are no longer possible because they are challenged completely and stopped by the unmanned vehicles of all kinds. We see the deep strikes, we see the operational depth strikes, we see the tactical depth strikes like 10, 20 kilometers, and the proliferation of the unmanned systems is just completely unprecedented. And we all understand that we are in a very, very beginning of this process. And I'm not even talking about the super new technologies such as AI, which is supposedly to some people going to determine the targets. We're not there yet. And it's very difficult to say when we'll be there, practically speaking. But what we do know is that there's been a system of automatic targeting with the human intervention, or with the GPS coordinates, or with some other type of guidance. But it's automatic guidance, and it's just dominating the field right now. There's been most of the destruction of the platforms, positions, and everything has been done through using the unmanned aviation. I can tell you that even in the governments of the key allied countries, it's still a challenge to understand the profound degree to which the nature of the war has been changed with this. And so all our strategies, which we need to develop, and internally and with our allies, they need to reflect the fact that the war is not going to be like it was 2 years ago, probably never. And we need to embrace that change, because unless we embrace it, it will be embraced just by our enemies. Mm-hmm. And we need to lead in that change, and we need to build up research institutions. We need to build up the technology exchange. We need to streamline the technological innovation, industrial collaboration, export control, all that, in order to be leaders in that process. Not like basically catching up or trying to think that this process happens somewhere else on some other continent, and here the things will go very differently. Every future war with whatever country in any continent will be determined by the new paradigms of air power. And we're talking about the things like redefinition of the term of air superiority, because very often these platforms are extremely agile. They are very they operate on a very low altitude. They do automatic targeting. They do dynamic targeting. They approach targets in motion, and they are so cheap that losing like 10 of them, 20 of them, 50 of them doesn't make any difference for your operational plans. Unlike with the traditional aviation, if you lose 20 tactical jets, you're obviously in a big trouble. Not in this case. And so basically, whatever the other like ground-based air defense is no longer sufficient to target that, because the rockets or the missiles which you use are more expensive than those drones. So it doesn't make any sense to chase them. And so we see right now there are some countries of the key Ukrainian allies which are thinking that they're sending everything they have, all kinds of weapons to Ukraine right now to test. They are happy to make all available technologies to Ukraine, like whatever they have, any components which we ask for, they're providing us. Because they think that unless they're tested in Ukraine, those weapons are going to be irrelevant. There's no point of investing in them because they may not work. And we could see here in the United States that some of the weapons which have been developed in the US and sent to Ukraine, that happen to be not competitive and they're no longer used, at least for the moment. There is still a chance to improve because the innovation cycle is extremely fast. And so so first of all, if we ignore that trend internationally, because we're not ignoring that trend locally in Ukraine, but if we ignore the trend internationally or undepreciate it, that's not a winning strategy in a general future. But also, we need to have the joint plan of winning using those opportunities. So we need to turn and make sure that these new trends are turned into the opportunities, develop the strategy which embraces them, and win using their strategies. That's the only thing we can do. Currently, Russia is absolutely not determined to stop the war. That's we're getting on a sort of strategic political level. Absolutely not determined to stop that war. If they decide to suggest the ceasefire, that's going to be only to gather the striking group, so basically to accumulate critical mass of capabilities, because right now, whatever they make or repair, it goes straight to the front. As you could see, even their victory parade, they had just one tank. And that's obviously not a coincidence because they simply have no spare resources to bring. But they would love to have a striking group. Basically, they would love to have the opportunity to gather critical mass of weapons. But otherwise, the plans are to continue. And there is an opinion even among the analysts and ourselves as well that they're building such a big industrial complex, such a big capability, that they will simply not be able to afford peace because they need to feed that beast forever because if it's not employed and if it's not supported by the war, essentially it's going to create internal problems for Russia. We can talk about this later. But nevertheless, so we need a strategy, and that strategy has to very clearly reflect what's happening in technological landscape.
Thank you, Andriy. That's a very interesting statement about they may not be able to afford peace.
Sure.
That we should unpack that. I wanted a quick technical follow-up to something you said. In terms of Russia updating their ISR capabilities with Zala drones, Orlan drones, the reconnaissance strike complex is improving. Have you noticed it more as a gradual improvement, or was there a period in time that you recall? Oh, sorry, I need to use my command voice. I'm going to speak a little bit louder.
Please do.
Have you noticed where Russian ISR, Russian reconnaissance strike has improved in a gradual sense, or there was a period that you could recall last year or some other time where there was a substantive qualitative change?
There's been a substantial increase this year, certainly, or the second half of the last year, but particularly this, from 2023 to 2024. We clearly can see that the concept of reconnaissance strike complex, which by the way was developed in the 1980s, purely as a theoretical one, and then it wasn't supported by any technologies available in the 1980s, and then obviously 90s and 2000s wasn't something where Russia progressed really with tech. But right now they improved it and they actually make it work. It's still vulnerable. We still understand that it's not a perfect weapon. It's not a Wunderwaffe, so to speak. It still has issues and it still has vulnerabilities. But certainly they are seeing that as a priority. They're investing money in this and they're trying as much as they can. And I can tell you, we have downed lots of their drones, and when we opened them up, they were full of Western components from all Western countries imaginable. And this has been a 2022, 2023, 2024. So all sanction mechanisms and so on, they're very important, but it's much more important to have secondary sanctions and to chase the companies which are avoiding them, because they're not making components. Yeah, well, China supports them a lot, so they have plenty of Chinese components, and whoever doubts about Chinese support to Russian military complex, here it is. So they're not submitting them the complete systems, but they're supplying all kinds of components needed. The actual participation of China in that is very obvious. But they're still trying and avoiding the sanctions and buying Western stuff a lot. And it's gradual change and it's gradual a gradual improvement. But that's bad news. And the good news is that it's still possible to win it. They still have some massive issues.
Thank you so much. Mike, let me turn it back to you. You've said in a few different articles and podcasts that Russia's strongest advantage is this year, and that period of opportunity may close for them moving into 2025 if you look at it from an equipment perspective or a manpower perspective. Can you unpack that assessment a little bit for us?
Yeah, sure. And I think sometimes people tend to interpret things a bit categorically in the sense that, okay, if Russia's advantage declines heading into next year, then that means something happens, Russia runs into a wall, or its ability to sustain the war becomes much more difficult. That's also not the case. But I think if we look right now at the current situation, right, both as a combination of challenges that we've had with materially resourcing Ukraine, challenges resulting from how the offensive ended last year, Russia's ended up in a position of relative material advantage because it conducted effective mobilization, defense industrial mobilization to some extent. But as we get into next year, right, the trajectory we're currently on, or at least perhaps a more optimistic trajectory, is that Ukraine will have stabilized its manpower pipeline, right? We'll have restored a lot of the manpower, for example, infantry that it needs to hold lines. We'll be entrenched, much more effectively entrenched. In terms of providing artillery ammunition and other things that Ukraine needs, not only do we have the funding, but Western production capacity is only increasing. Will have increased significantly next year. So Russia will still be advantaged in some of these categories, but those advantages will decrease. If you look at major constraints, while Russia has an advantage in manpower and has been replacing their losses, albeit at a lower rate, I think, this year than last year, Russia's critical constraint, or at least greatest limiting factor right now, is equipment. Russia's been burning through a lot of equipment, and it can't afford too many offensives like Avdiivka. If we just look at the way they're conducting combat operations now, most of them are with fairly small numbers of armored fighting vehicles, a lot of dismounted infantry, right? And if you look across the categories of equipment that Russia is using, it's fair to say that 70 to 80% of this is coming out of storage. So Russia's eating through its Soviet legacy. Yes, Russian production has increased at home, but nowhere near enough to replace the losses. And so something's going to have to give as we get into next year. They will have to change the way they operate in a manner that will dramatically reduce their ability to really make any gains on the ground, or they're going to have real challenges replacing the equipment at the pace that they've been going. Last point on this. This is a conversation that's very much focused on land at the front, but it is increasingly becoming clear that this war is not going to be decided by who controls the next 20 or 10 or 20 kilometers of the Donbass. That's just not the reality, and that's not where the center of gravity lies. So some of the big questions we need to be asking ourselves need to look more at the Russian strike campaign against Ukrainian critical infrastructure, the increase in Russian production of missiles of various types and precision-guided munitions, the improvement in Russian dynamic targeting behind the front line, better realization of recon strike, recon fire, what Andriy was commenting on, and how that interacts with other challenges we've been having, which is supplying Ukraine with sufficient air defense, finding cheaper, more cost-effective solutions to this problem, or enabling Ukraine to conduct strikes against things like air bases or other critical military infrastructure in Russia that will help offset or push further away the basing for Russian tactical aviation. So I think as the front, well, let's not say ossifies, but as neither side will be able to significantly shift the front line, perhaps as we get into this winter, or at least for the near term, much of the war, at least the part of the war that I think really matters, will be displaced more into critical infrastructure strikes, things that affect economic viability of Ukraine, or ability to sustain the war in that manner.
I thank you so much, Mike. I'd like to, so I leave enough time for questions and answers, I'd like to combine a question to both Andriy and Hanna. In terms of defense acquisition strategy for Ukraine, what type of supports or investments are really a high priority right now for the Ukrainian defense industrial base to assure short-term and long-term domestic production? And what is the status of those investments and agreements, and what recommendations do you have?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I was talking about the new tech and the new capabilities, I don't want to sound like they are only which matter and we don't need fundamental capabilities which been already proven and so on. They are changing their use. For example, particularly with like tank forces, for instance, and so on, which is the most dramatic one. But generally speaking, of course, we do need the basic technologies and the basic capabilities because nothing can stop infantry more better than artillery, and so on and so on. There's many examples. I don't want to. They're like classical and fundamental ones. So for that, we do need to boost Ukrainian production, and that Ukrainian production should be jointly with the NATO countries' production, because the Ukrainian transition to the Western formats and Western calibers and Western type of equipment is irreversible, and there is absolutely no point of turning back. Western equipment is better, even the most basic models. It's more precise, and it's better functioning. So the years of innovations, years of trying and error actually worked out. So, and actually that's a big problem for Russia, because their artillery is still much, much worse. And they are, even tanks are much worse and so on. So we need to focus on that. But we shouldn't be an illusion that the Ukraine will constantly be supplied by the West with whatever it needs to establish, especially if, in a concept of the long-term security. Because the math matters. And as you know, there's many countries, particularly in continental Europe, who woke up to the war understanding that they have a one-day supply of the ammunition. Now they're trying to ramp up. Now they're setting up factories, but to set up facility in continental Europe is extremely difficult, including because of the labor laws and so on and so on, and bureaucracy, permits, and they're still not on a war footing. So we need to do it for ourselves. And of course, there are lots of already programs of collaboration where there is a transition of technologies, and that can only be enhanced. So that can only be sped up, and so we can make, but particularly some weapons are not that sophisticated. So this is not like a rocket science, literally. So like to make artillery is not that difficult compared to some other systems. But these basic weapons are absolutely critical, and they need it in a large numbers. If we're talking about territories such as Ukraine with 1,500 kilometers, just over 1,000 miles of front line, plus Belarusian border, plus coastline, and so on. At the same time, we need to innovate, and we need to build up joint labs and joint technology centers to study how the new weapons behaving, and what is working, what is not working, and so on. And you never know in advance. And this is constantly changing, constantly evolving. So the speed of collaboration and the technology exchange, lessons learned exchange, it is critical. If we don't understand that we need to do this as soon as possible and fast and absolutely on a war footing, and not like normally in a defense industry when R&D cycles taking like 5-10 years and so on. There's no 5-10 years for that. That if we don't understand that jointly and don't do joint projects, it would be a historical mistake. So I sincerely hope that we're not going to make it. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, well, I want to ask the last question to Hanna before we go into our audience Q&As. We're looking at two important events coming up this summer. This is the upcoming Peace Summit in Switzerland, and then the upcoming NATO Summit. And what do you think is possible for Ukraine at this time in terms of achieving bilateral security agreements or other defense industrial agreements, and what is needed to signal that enduring commitment to Ukraine?
You know, definitely these two events are that much different in terms of the goals and the tasks that are there that we cannot put them in the same basket. If we speak about the Peace Summit that should be this weekend in Switzerland, we're talking about finding a certain universal principles where we can unite the maximum of the international community, and we are speaking about almost 100 nations that are confirming their participation at the top level. About 3 issues, because there are 10 points of the peace plan, but in Switzerland they will concentrate only on 3 of them. It is the food security, it is the nuclear security, and it is the exchange of the prisoners. So I cannot name them purely humanitarian issues, but that is definitely the issues where we can unite a lot of countries, even those who decided to take a neutral position, like India, for example, who are coming there. And the idea is that the Russian aggression against Ukraine raised so many fundamental issues about the international order, about the international system, about the principles, how we operate, that we cannot come just to the bilateral negotiations about the peace. We need to understand where we as the international community are coming. What are the principles, how we would like to speak about the safety, not just nuclear non-proliferation that we have the principles, but safety of the nuclear objects that can be used as the and weaponized during the war, or how we can weaponize food and what consequences it have, not only for the Ukrainian economy that we are not capable to export, but also to the prices in Africa or the Latin America or Middle East, where we saw the long-term consequences of these. So the Peace Summit will be more about this, setting the principles, building the coalition of the willing for these type of the issues that can touch a wider international community, and also to include so-called global community. So how we can attract the countries of the Middle East, of Latin America, of Asia, also to understand why this is important for them, why they should be present there. When we go to the NATO summit, that's absolutely different purposes. That's understandable. That's first of all about security. It's first of all about alliance and allies of Ukraine, those who are ready to support Ukraine in terms of defense and security, military. So there is no topic of food security discussed there, but we are discussing issues of Ukrainian interoperability. We are discussing about the threats from Russia and China. We are discussing the issues of Ukrainian future membership and what we can do for this. We are discussing in general the European security and how it is jeopardized more and more each year because of the Russian actions. Because if 2 years ago at the summit, the questions were like, yeah, that's about Ukraine. We need to defend the eastern flank in case of anything. But that was more about like, you are there, we are here. We are not part of this war. For the last 2.5 years, Russia proved that they consider any of the NATO allies as the party to the conflict. So they behave like this with the provocations in the Baltics and in the Nordic, in Arctic, with the operations with spies, with everything. So it's either the NATO countries are ready for this escalation, or they will be just too late for this, like no time over there. So it's not just about Ukraine now, it is about the joint security that we are talking. And here there are a lot of challenges for us because Ukrainian expectations definitely the clear definition about our future membership. But we understand that, especially during the election year, the US is not ready for this. So now we still have 1 month before the summit. The question is what we can find as the best possible solution. Because this best solution is important not only for Ukraine to be assured in our partners, but that's also the question for NATO and for the United States, because Russia is using it increasingly in their propaganda that, okay, NATO doesn't need you, Americans will betray you, nobody is going to help you, we can continue with this, so why you care about your Western partners? And for us, it would be extremely important to give that wording in the final declaration that will not allow the Russian propaganda to use it, as they're using it not only in Ukraine or post-Soviet space, and we need to be very careful about this. I spent a lot of time now in Asian countries, in Middle Eastern countries, in those countries that are the US partners and allies. In each of these countries, Australia, Korea, Qatar, the second question was after what is the situation in Ukraine, do you believe that Americans will help you? Can we be sure that in case any crisis happening, US will be here to support us? Taiwan, Philippines, we can go with more and more countries where these questions are already not theoretical, but very practical. That's why the decisions of the NATO summit will also have this second level effect to the global partners of NATO and of the United States, how significant their trust in the US capabilities will be.
Thank you, Hanna. Thank you. So there's a lot of really great questions coming in. Some of them are technical, some of them are more diplomatic. And being a military analyst, I'm going to go for the technical ones first. I'd like to bundle these. Question for anyone on the panel. Is there an effort underway to combat Russian GPS jamming or Russian electronic warfare systems in particular? And how is Ukraine's logistical capacity being impacted by persistent surveillance, and are they changing their tactics?
There is a constant research about how to tackle jamming. And this research goes in a way of like making more immune GPSs. This research goes to set up different guidance platforms, which are not GPS-based. This also goes to how to destroy EW emitters, detect and destroy it, find, fix, and finish. And also, of course, there's a massive research happening in terms of the visual recognition, automatic visual recognition. With the latest one, we are so far, I think, in an early stage. With the other ones, we are on some practical stage, and there are like some very practical results. So EW, particularly jamming and spoofing, as well as guidance, would be constant arms race. So it's like they're improving, and the countermeasures are improving. They're improving countermeasures. Specialists are saying that to improve the EW would be more difficult simply because the systems are large. You need to change your production schedules. You need to change. Basically, you need to do more investments in this. So there is opportunity that if the countermeasures are done quickly and receive enough support, enough funding, attention, collaboration, they can be ahead. But that of course is a challenge right now, tremendous challenge. Second one is obviously that reconnaissance drones are making tremendous difficulties for Ukraine, particularly in the area of like what we call the tactical depths of 10, 20 kilometers. So that zone is like completely proliferated with unmanned platforms, often guided by the reconnaissance drones, hanging on a altitude of up to 6 kilometers, and there are ways to tackle that, but we are still catching up. So there's still a lot of room to improve.
Very brief addition. I mean, first of all, we are all paying attention to the jamming, but the last months, as we see the increase of the spoofing, especially in the Black Sea. And if that has the military consequences, naval consequences, and we see it not only in the Black Sea, but also in the Baltics that Russians are using it, and in the Nordic Sea, but that has the significant impact on the civilian navigation as well. So the fact that Russia were using the military instruments, they are not afraid to jeopardize the civilian operations, including in the zones where it is their like ships predominantly. So if you look what is happening around the Kerch Bridge and in the eastern part of the Black Sea, marine traffic will show you at least half of the ships as they are not there. So physically we see that they're in this port, but the point will be that they are somewhere in Moscow or in the mid of Crimea. And the experts who are monitoring it on the daily basis, they noticed a significant increase and problems that it can lead for the future navigation. But also the question is, like the drones reconnaissance, that's one that we are talking about, but Russians are using a lot of the satellites, of the commercial satellites pictures. And there were also already several research that found the clear correlation between the time when Russians are buying a lot of the pictures and they attack at the certain place. So we understand that they are relying on the Western satellites and the private companies where they can freely buy. Sometimes they are buying through the intermediary, sometimes even directly, because it is like commercial. I would like just to see what is around my house, but then they're using it at the battlefield. And here is the question to the sanctions, like the fact that is the question how we can improve the sanctions regime so Russians will not use the commercial satellites for the military activities.
Thank you.
Well, I think a lot of the key points have already been made. What I'd say is that for tactical systems, most of them typically don't rely on GPS to begin with. The main issue for them is jamming of the command signal because many of these systems are limited to the frequencies they operate on. And so increasingly the contest, at least in number of drone systems, is evolving from a quantitative to more of a qualitative dimension. That is, we're kind of at the limits of what the base commercial system allows you to do. And now they do need significant modifications. These can include home on jam terminal guidance. These can include modifications with visual recognition, basically AI-enabled terminal guidance in a contested environment where the system can navigate the last several hundred meters on its own. Andriy, I think, thoughtfully alluded to more long-range systems, perhaps increasingly will come to depend on forms of visual recognition as their principal form of guidance, because we're increasingly in a place where the typical forms of guidance that are developed for our systems are from the late 1980s, right? Let's be frank about that. And not to say that they're not viable, but they're far less effective in a contemporary environment. And as always, these are iterative interactions. You know, I traveled to Ukraine, spent time on the front lines, as some folks know. And generally, the battlefield evolves and interaction technology evolves every 3 months or so, right? And so systems that might have been very relevant or very effective in the first year of the war are much less capable or much less significant in the second year of the war. Or it's now their third or fourth version of that system, and the mode of fighting or the way they're implemented, the tactics that are being employed have changed significantly as well. And so it's unfortunately, for lack of a better word, an ever-shifting or moving target. Well, I will say it's clear that electronic warfare, as I think many Ukrainian colleagues describe it, is essentially a jungle, both on the Ukrainian and the Russian side. New systems are developed. You know, if you go today, you'll see folks have personal jammers, personal frequency detectors to let them know that drones are coming, all sorts of new types of systems for jamming and radio electronic interception. Electronic warfare has gotten small. It's gotten much more interesting and evolved. Like drones themselves have also become, they've proliferated, right? And so it's even hard to have a good grasp on it. But last point, I want to reinforce something Andriy said, that these technologies have proven to be additive and they're important offsets, right? But they have not allowed either side to establish a decisive advantage on the battlefield. Drones by themselves do not hold terrain, nor by themselves do they take terrain either. And they are not a substitute for the fundamentals, right? Issues with manpower, with the ability to employ forces of scale, or deficits in key categories such as maintenance sustainments, or artillery ammunition. They are an offset, they substitute to an extent, right? But volume of fire, the shock effect of artillery, has not been replaced yet by drones. So this is important to kind of characterize it, because technology, the conversation will often, gravitate towards the technological dimension as sort of the future, but it's important to put it into that context, I think.
Thank you. Got a question here from the audience. What are your perspectives on Putin's nuclear reminders and threats this year and last year, especially recent remarks on potentially changing the country's nuclear doctrine? We've seen a lot with tactical nuclear weapons exercises. We've seen nuclear threats. What do you all make of this in terms of signaling and escalation? Where are we?
He clearly been sent enough messages that currently deterring him to getting to the escalation ladder. At the same time, he tries to do whatever possible in order to still use the nuclear threat as a tool. Tool which obviously he works in some respect, particularly as a self-deterrence tool for some, governments from, standing away from a certain steps. Like, for instance, there's clearly the escalation question for the U.S. administration, and escalation theory is not a math. So it's very much based on perceptions. It's very much based on game theory. It's very much based on some subjective understanding of the situation. But clearly, there's been indicators that Putin, let's put it this way, he clearly understands that by using nuclear weapons, he will make situations seriously worse for himself, seriously worse for Russia. So that's why we haven't seen actual steps. But they would love to still use that opportunity to remind people. And that's why they use all kinds of creative ways, including questions on economic forum, for instance, like what about the nuclear and so on, in order to remind everybody that they have that possibility, but at the same time they're not directly threatening anyone.
I usually say that nuclear weapons for Putin is his Viagra, because that are when and how he's using, he needs it more for the psychological effect. What is deterrence is the factor, first of all. And here we understand that the Putin and in general Russian tactic, if they see that something is working, they're not going creatively finding something different. It is working, why to change? So the nuclear threat is something what is working very well for the Western, including countries that own the nuclear weapons themselves, so they should have plans, understanding, intelligence, and wherever. So as, each time when we're asking, like, for example, why you are not going to support Ukraine more, or why you would not like to give us NATO perspective, escalation, what does mean escalation? In the end of the conversation, you always come to the conclusion, they can use a nuclear weapon. So for Putin, if it works, why not to use it? Because he understands that de facto there is no other advantage what he can demonstrate against the Westerners. Economy is better in the NATO countries, like more money available there. Theoretically, the technologies are better, the coalition is bigger. So what? Nuclear. Nuclear works, why not to use it? The question is that when he would make decision to use it, that will be a clear understanding for everybody, including inside of Russia, that it means he lost with all conventional weapons. And here is the question, would he like to demonstrate that he lost and how it would be used against him or not? And here it doesn't matter what type of the nuclear weapons he will use or at which of the territories. That will be more like the last resort decision rather than the strategic decision that will be a bifurcation point of some change. Because in this case, he can lose even China. And we here should not underestimate the Chinese factor that with all current support that China is giving. That's in their classical strategy of the triangle to support who is weaker. But as soon as Russia is giving more statements about the nuclear, the country who is really calling and talking like, please don't do it, we are against, it's usually Chinese. Because for them, the overuse of the rhetoric about the use of the nuclear weapons and undermining this classical nuclear deterrence that we used to be is something that, at least as for now, they're not going to cross the line, and they're trying to keep the Russians in the framework.
Yeah.
I guess I'll briefly add that I think that as far as nuclear rhetoric goes, this has had tremendously diminishing returns for Russia since the start of the war. It's very clear. The second point I make is that there hasn't really been much in the way of any significant change in the readiness or posture of Russian nuclear forces to match the rhetoric, which is why it hasn't had much of an effect on us. Even most recently, the nuclear forces exercise, I don't think there was anything particularly alarming or concerning about it, to be frank. And this sort of rhetoric, while it is cheap and easy to engage in, and maybe it has an effect on some European countries, some of it is also aimed clearly at domestic audiences, because whenever there's a problem, the political leadership reaches those kind of rhetoric. It's sort of meat for a particular audience within Russia to make them feel great, like Russia has nuclear weapons, and Russia can destroy some small European state with its nuclear weapons. And so I sometimes think we become, yes, we are the one of the targets of this rhetoric, but we also become inadvertent consumers of this type of messaging that's aimed in part at domestic audiences. And lastly, regarding the overall discourse of nuclear escalation, I think it's clear to most folks that if there was ever a concern, it was when the conditions were there where Russia might even consider a discussion on nuclear use. And this was mostly during fall, October, November of 2022, and we really have not been back to that moment since. And so neither the conditions are there, nor have there been, as far as one can tell from public sources, significant changes in the Russian nuclear force posture or readiness to match this rhetoric in order for it to have any sort of coercive effect.
I just will add that we need to be very careful understanding that if the Russian deterrence, like by using nuclear rhetoric, works too well, and that would create escalation effect by itself. So it's a paradox, but basically because and not just between in this particular war, but generally, it may cause the proliferation because as some other countries will see that. If Russia is losing with conventional, but still gains with the nuclear rhetoric, that makes sense then to obtain nuclear weapons. So the strategic result of this war has to be that Russia is not just failing with conventional, but also fails with nuclear rhetoric and its impact on decisions. We crossed many red lines which they were putting already by far. And still fighting and still understanding what we're doing and where we are. Need to keep doing that and don't deter ourselves too much.
Thank you, Andriy. We have time for one more question. I'm going to combine these. They're similar.
Frankenstein question?
No, they're moving as I'm looking at them. Sorry. What, in your view, would be the most productive approach for NATO to take towards Ukraine, both to bring the war to an end and to preclude a future recurrence or expansion? And then part two, other than NATO membership, is there a practicable form of Western security guarantee which would deter future Russian aggression?
There is a substantial work right now is done, including by U.S. administration, as we heard from the officials during this trip, that to create capability coalitions, to create some sort of packages, all those initiatives, including NATO representatives. NATO, of course, has a massive potential role, and that role is can be with the uniting European nations in order to have a single policy for the supporting regional stability. I'm not talking about just Ukraine, I'm talking regional stability as a whole. We should get out of the paradigm of thinking that this war is regional, and particularly between two countries, as some people still do. Clearly, Russia is Russia is aiming to destroy architecture, and some people even say that they're already destroying it, and some people say it's destroyed, but whatever. Clearly, NATO is in a great position to be a unifying factor for the Western nations to be building up that architecture, defending that architecture. There's many different programs of collaboration between Ukraine and NATO until Ukraine becomes the member. NATO nations should never say Ukraine will become a member maybe someday, but so far it's not on the table and so on and so on. That sounds extremely weak. It's almost like Russia convinced NATO not to take Ukraine, and that's absolutely not the message we want to send. Even though it's not on the table for the moment, there clearly needs to be a very constructive approach to that, not give Putin a gift of achieving something. But at the same time, there is like a lot of things we can do together with NATO, both as US NATO, Ukraine NATO, and European nations with NATO, where we can build a very strong basis for the architecture, and NATO is a perfect platform for that.
Thank you.
I would say that, first of all, NATO needs to remember for what they've been created for. They've been a decade when NATO became too soft. And we understand that we prioritize different threats, different challenges, but at the same time, it allowed to relax about the European security a lot. And the first ring was in 2014, but as it's appeared in 2022, all those threats that raised were not enough for NATO to return back to the basics and to understand why they've been created and what is the added value of this alliance, in addition to the joint training or some of the nice statements for the future. But the second question is that what Putin is really afraid of, it is the unity of the Western partners. For him, it's easier to work with each individual country one by one. That's why he hates European Union, that's why he hates NATO, because it's easier for him to work with Hungary separately, with Germany separately, with France separately. But when somebody, any of the organizations is very united in their position, that is the worst case scenario. That's why he undermined for years the unity of the European Union, trying to negotiate with the individuals, why in energy, for example, issues or in some others. That's what he's doing now with NATO. So for NATO, and that is indirectly is very important, or even directly for Ukraine, is important that NATO remains united in all the decisions they're making about Ukraine. That we don't have Hungary who would suddenly start blocking because of the domestic agenda, even recognizing that Russia is the aggressor, but because they had some issues to Ukraine or to Brussels or to Washington, they will undermine the unity of the organizations, because that is exactly the moment when Russia would like to see and where they start actively working to undermining any of the other actions. In terms of Ukraine, Ukraine made a decision that we would like to be in NATO, not because we don't understand the some difficulties that can be there, but because there is, let's be honest, there is nothing better. Yeah. So any of the bilateral agreements, they would be important, but they would be important only as the part of the future goal of becoming part of the NATO family. Because for us, it is everything. It's both alliance that is capable of protecting, that is the principles, but that is also all those democratic reforms that are coming. Because for Ukraine, the NATO membership is not only the ultimate goal, but that is also getting out of the Soviet doctrine in terms of the military, in terms of the defense, in terms of the security services, and in terms of just the good governance. If you look to the annual national program, especially the previous variants, you see a significant part that is not about the security services or the defense complex of Ukraine. It is about anti-corruption, it is about the good governance, it is about the democracy. So all those things that Ukraine would like to be at the necessary level. And that's how Ukraine perceives the future membership with all this complex, but not only about the possibility of the 2, 3, 27 military to work together.
Thank you so much. Mike, we have one minute left. Any lightning round thoughts on that question?
On NATO? I think I agree with what Hanna said. NATO's not just a destination, it's also a process. I think what I would add is colleagues did a great job offering the Ukrainian perspective on us. I think just from maybe an American analyst point of view, I think it's important that NATO thinks through the long term and how Ukraine fits into European security. Although Ukraine is not in NATO right now, Ukraine is an important contributor to European security. and will be a part of it and a pillar of it. And while we tend to focus on the near term, the war right now, stabilizing the front, immediate needs, yesterday it was artillery, today it's air defense, so on and so forth, reconstituting the force, there's also a great deal of thought that needs to be done with regards to what does the Ukrainian military look like, what should it look like to be able to effectively defend and deter future Russian aggression. What is NATO's role in that? For example, NATO typically excels at things like training and whatnot, which Ukraine will need great assistance with, especially if it's going to mobilize significant amounts of manpower, right? And what should Ukraine's relationship with NATO look over this time period, rather than the typical political conversation we have here of, here comes the next summit, what can we expect at the next summit, so on and so forth. To me, this is a more important conversation to have, and a broader conversation to have about future European security, security architecture, how Ukraine fits into that, and what is NATO's role beyond the immediate day-to-day tactical grind that folks like me tend to get sucked into. And I know so do you, Dara, because we work together.
Well, I could sit on here and talk with these guys about any number of things. You all have given us so much to think about, very dense and very helpful information. So thank you both for traveling here to being with us. Mike, thank you. And thank all of you for joining us. So please join me in a round of applause for our panelists. And you're welcome to come up and chat with them for all these great questions that we couldn't get to today. So thank you very much, everyone.
What time is it?